I was halfway out the door when I felt a gentle tug at my sleeve, and when I turned, it was my friend. I hadn't planned on staying long that night. My friend had invited me to a small gathering at his house. Nothing fancy, just a mix of family and close friends celebrating his birthday. I told myself I'd drop in, say hello, maybe grab a drink, and slip out before anyone really noticed I was there. But the second I stepped into the warm hum of that living room, I realized this night would stay with me far longer than I expected. The room itself was ordinary enough, soft yellow light spilling from a few lamps, the low thrum of music in the background, the sound of glasses clinking every now and then. People stood in small circles, conversations overlapping like a gentle tide. But in the middle of all that chatter, my attention kept drifting toward one person. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, nor the center of every conversation. In fact, that was exactly why I noticed her. My friend's aunt. She stood a little apart, laughing at someone's story with the kind of ease that didn't need to demand attention. Her laugh, low, unhurried, genuine, cut through the noise and reached me without effort. She carried herself in a way that made the crowded room feel like a backdrop to her presence, not the other way around. I'd seen her once or twice before at family events, but something about her that night was different. Maybe it was the way her eyes seemed to land on me more than once, as though she was quietly aware of me in a way no one else was. Not staring, not obvious, just noticing. And that small, knowing smile she gave me across the room left my chest tight, like she knew a secret I didn't. My friend teased me once, saying his aunt had a way of making people feel seen. At the time, I laughed it off. But standing there now, catching her gaze again, I understood exactly what he meant. I told myself it was nothing, just a glance, just politeness. But the truth was, every time her eyes lingered a second longer than necessary, I felt it. The air between us seemed to shift, charged with something I couldn't name yet. I remember trying to focus on the people around me, nodding along to conversations, forcing smiles, but the sound of her voice kept pulling me back. It was deeper than I expected, calm but layered with warmth. When she spoke, people leaned in, as if her words carried more weight simply because she was the one saying them. And then, there was the way she looked at me when I wasn't speaking at all. Not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with an interest that felt personal. Almost like she was measuring me, not in a critical way, but as if she was quietly wondering who I was beneath the surface. By the time I realized how often my eyes were searching for her in that crowded room, I knew this night wasn't going to end as simply as I'd planned. Aunt, looking at me in a way that made the whole room fade. It was later in the evening when the crowd began to shift. Some people were gathering near the cake. Others settled into deeper conversations. I drifted into the kitchen, half looking for a refill, half searching for a quiet corner away from the noise. And that's where I found her. She stood by the counter, her hand resting lightly on the stem of a wine glass, watching the room the way someone watches waves. Not impatient, just quietly present. When her eyes met mine, she gave a small smile, one that felt like an invitation without words. I offered a polite nod and moved toward the fridge, but before I could even think of what to say, she spoke first. "You don't look like you're enjoying the crowd," she said softly, her voice low enough that it felt meant just for me. I laughed under my breath, a little caught off guard. "Is it that obvious?" "Not obvious," she replied, tilting her head with the faintest smirk. "Just you don't strike me as the type to get lost in a crowd. You'd rather talk one-on-one." She wasn't wrong, and the way she said it, like she saw straight through me without hesitation, pulled me in before I realized it. We ended up talking there by the counter, leaning slightly toward one another, as though the rest of the party had faded behind us. She asked questions that weren't just polite small talk. She wanted to know what I was working on, what I cared about, how I spent my time outside of the routine answers people usually give. And when she listened, she really listened. Her eyes held mine steadily, as if every word mattered. In return, she shared pieces of herself, small glimpses into her life. Stories about traveling when she was younger, choices she made, moments she laughed at herself. But in between, there were hints of something more. A kind of wistfulness, like she wasn't just telling me facts about her life, but offering me a glimpse of the emotions underneath them. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and red wine. The light above us was dim, soft, and made the edges of her face glow with a warmth that felt too intimate for a casual gathering. I became aware of how close we were standing, just enough that, when she gestured with her hand, her fingers brushed lightly against my arm. It was the smallest touch, gone in an instant, but it lit a spark that lingered far longer. I caught myself wondering if she felt it too. The way her laugh came more easily when I spoke. The way her eyes didn't wander the room the way everyone else's did. They stayed on me. And then, almost without meaning to, I found myself studying the contrast between us. The calm poise in her voice against my nervous energy. Her steadiness against the quick rhythm in my chest. It should have felt strange, me in my 20s and her years ahead of me in experience. But it didn't. If anything, it felt natural. Like we'd skipped past the surface-level introductions and slipped into something deeper without realizing how. When my friend came into the kitchen, laughing loudly and asking if we were solving the world's problems, she just smiled, glanced at me with a quiet sparkle in her eyes, and replied, "Something like that." And I knew right then that what was happening between us wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of something I couldn't ignore. The night stretched on in that way gatherings often do. People shifting from one room to another, conversations breaking and reforming, laughter spilling through the air like ripples. Yet no matter where I went, it felt like I was quietly orbiting her. And the strange part was, she seemed to be orbiting me too. I found myself back in the living room, a half-empty glass in hand, when I noticed her again. She was across the room, laughing at something someone had said, her hand resting loosely on the back of a chair. But then her gaze slipped away from the group and found mine. It wasn't just a glance. It was a pause. A look held long enough for me to know it wasn't accidental. And when she realized I hadn't looked away either, a faint smile curved her lips before she turned back to the conversation. That smile stayed with me like a quiet secret. A little later, I offered to help clear some glasses and plates. It wasn't much, but it gave me an excuse to move, to feel less like a restless guest lingering at the edges. She must have had the same idea, because when I stepped into the hallway with a tray, she was there too, carrying a couple of wine glasses in her hands. "Looks like we had the same plan," I said with a laugh. She tilted her head, her eyes catching the light. "Or maybe I just knew you'd be too polite to let me do it alone." I couldn't tell if she was teasing or serious, but the way her fingers brushed mine when she passed me one of the glasses felt deliberate, warm, lingering just a second too long. In the kitchen, the air seemed quieter than before, though faint music still carried from the living room. She placed the glasses down and, for a moment, neither of us moved. I could smell the faint sweetness of her perfume. Not overpowering but subtle, like it belonged to her and no one else. "Thank you," she said softly. Though it wasn't just about the glasses. It was the kind of thank you that meant more, though I couldn't quite put words to it. I nodded, but my chest tightened with something I couldn't shake. The space between us was small, but it felt charged, like the air before a storm. I noticed the way she looked at me when I wasn't speaking, steady, searching, almost like she was testing her own resolve. The moment didn't need words. The silence was its own kind of conversation. Her hand lingered on the counter, just close enough that mine could have reached out, and I wondered if she was thinking the same thing I was. When someone called her name from the other room, she drew back just slightly, her expression composed again, though her eyes gave her away. They held the same unspoken pull that had been tugging at me all evening. As she turned to leave, she gave me that same quiet smile as before. Small, knowing, impossible to ignore. And in that instant, I knew this wasn't coincidence anymore. This was something building between us, whether either of us admitted it or not. By the time the night began to wind down, I told myself it was time to slip away. Guests were starting to leave in twos and threes, laughter drifting out the door with them into the cool night air. I didn't want to overstay, and truthfully, part of me thought it was safer to leave before whatever was happening between us grew too obvious. To her, to me, to anyone else. I grabbed my jacket from the back of a chair and moved quietly toward the door, rehearsing a polite goodbye I could give my friend the next day. But just as my hand brushed the doorknob, I felt it, the lightest tug at my sleeve. I froze. Turning slightly, I found her standing there, close enough that I could see the faint reflection of the lamp in her eyes. She wasn't smiling this time. Her expression was softer, almost unreadable, but her hand remained on my sleeve, holding me in place as though she wasn't ready for me to disappear. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. I tried to smile to play it off. Didn't want to get in the way. Figured it was a good time to head out. Her fingers tightened just slightly, enough that I noticed. "You weren't in the way." She hesitated, searching my face, then added, "Not for me." The air seemed to still around us. I was suddenly aware of how close we were, the background chatter muffled by the pounding of my own heartbeat. For a moment I forgot how to answer. "I didn't want to assume," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Some things don't need assuming." She let go of my sleeve, but only to brush her hand down lightly against my arm, a gesture that lingered like a question. My pulse thudded beneath her touch. Someone laughed in the living room, breaking the silence for a moment. But here, by the door, it felt like the rest of the house had melted away. I should have walked out. That was the logical choice, the safe choice. But the way she was looking at me, steady, unguarded, with a trace of something deeper, made it impossible to move. Her voice softened, almost confessional. "It's been a long time since I felt like I didn't want a night to end." The words hit me harder than I expected, because I felt the same. I told myself all evening that this connection was just coincidence, that I was imagining it. But her tug at my sleeve, her eyes on mine, stripped away all doubt. I took a quiet breath, searching for something to say, something to hold on to. But all I managed was a single truth, spoken before I could think twice. "Neither do I." And in that fragile pause, the line between us blurred. Not with a kiss, not with anything reckless, but with the unmistakable knowledge that neither of us wanted to let go. The room around us seemed to shrink the longer we sat there. The murmur of the party had quieted into nothing more than distant noise, and even the rain outside faded until all I could really hear was the uneven rhythm of my own heartbeat. She had leaned back against the couch, one leg tucked slightly beneath her, her body angled toward me. Our shoulders brushed now and then as we spoke, but neither of us pulled away. The conversation had shifted from light to heavy without either of us realizing it. One moment we were talking about travel, about books, about things that felt safe. The next, she went quiet, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she was deciding whether or not to let the words escape. Finally, she said it. "It's been years," she whispered, "since someone made me feel this alive." The words hit me like a wave. They were tender, but threaded with something raw, loneliness, maybe, or the admission of how much she'd kept locked away. I didn't know what to say at first. My throat was dry, my pulse pounding. All I managed was honesty. "You make me feel the same. From the moment you smiled at me tonight, I haven't been able to look at anyone else." Her eyes flicked up to mine then, and for a heartbeat we just stared at each other. The tension was thick, almost unbearable. If I leaned forward just a little, I could have kissed her. If she reached for me, I would have met her halfway without hesitation. But neither of us moved. Her hand rested on the cushion between us, fingers curled just slightly, close enough that I could see the faint tremor in them. Slowly, almost without thinking, I shifted my own hand until it hovered near hers. Not touching, not yet, just close enough to feel the pull. Her breath caught. She noticed. "I shouldn't," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "I know," I said softly. My voice felt like it belonged to someone else. "But do you want to?" Her eyes closed briefly, as though the question itself hurt. When she opened them again, they shone with something unspoken. Fear, longing, maybe both. "That's the problem," she said. "I do." The silence that followed was louder than any answer could have been. My hand inched closer until the sides of our fingers brushed. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers linger against mine. Feather light but enough to send heat rushing through my chest. We sat like that, suspended in a moment that felt both fragile and infinite. Neither of us willing to break it, neither of us brave enough to push it further. And I realized then that this was the crossroads. One step closer and everything would change. One step back and the moment would dissolve into something we'd never speak of again. But in that pause, with her hand trembling against mine, I knew the decision wasn't really mine to make. It was hers, and all I could do was wait. The rain had slowed outside, leaving the house wrapped in a hushed stillness. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the low hum of voices as the last few guests lingered. But here, in the small sitting room, it felt like the world had narrowed to just us. She hadn't moved her hand away. Her fingers still brushed mine, a fragile point of contact that carried more meaning than any embrace. It was enough to make my chest ache, enough to tell me she was torn between what she wanted and what she thought she should want. Finally, she drew in a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling slowly. "We should stop," she whispered, though the way her thumb traced the edge of my finger betrayed her. "Before this becomes something we can't take back." I swallowed, the weight of her words pressing against my ribs. "And if it already is?" Her eyes flicked to mine, wide and unguarded, before she looked away again. She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she shifted, turning toward me fully. And then, in a gesture that was both tender and devastating, she reached up and cupped my face in her hand. Her palm was warm against my cheek, her touch steady even as her voice trembled. "Don't forget this," she said softly, like it was both a plea and a command. I closed my eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch, memorizing the feel of it. I couldn't, even if I tried. For a heartbeat, I thought she might close the distance between us. Her gaze dropped to my lips, then lifted back to my eyes. But instead of crossing that final line, she leaned forward and pressed a lingering kiss to my cheek. It was gentle, but it carried every unspoken word we'd held back that night. When she pulled away, I saw the conflict in her face. Strength and longing, restraint and desire. It was all there, layered and raw. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," said, my chest tightening. "But I know this isn't nothing. You know it too." She held my gaze for a long moment, then finally nodded. Not in agreement, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. A shared understanding that what had sparked between us tonight wasn't going away. She stood slowly, smoothing her hand down her skirt, then offered me the faintest smile. "Come on. I'll walk you to the door." We moved together down the quiet hallway, the dim light casting our shadows long against the walls. At the door, she opened it for me, the night air cool against my skin. For a moment, neither of us moved. And then she touched my hand one last time, letting her fingers linger as if reluctant to let go. "Good night," she whispered. "Good night," I echoed, though it felt far too small for what I wanted to say. As I stepped outside, my heart heavy but alive, one thought echoed in my mind. Her hand had tugged me back once tonight, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more age gap romance stories, and share it with someone who loves slow burn connections. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my place?